Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Chris Hayden, and on behalf of Fierce Life Sciences, I'd like to welcome our panel discussion on accelerating clinical trials with real-world data, turning investment into impact. And this webinar today is brought to you by IMO Health. Now, before we get started, I do have a couple of housekeeping notes to get through. Just be patient. I promise I'll be fast. If you happen to close one of the panels and you need to reopen it, just click on the name of the panel in the navigation bar at the top of the screen, and it'll pop back open for you. I want to let you know the webinar is being recorded today, and it will be available on demand within 24 hours. You don't have to do anything. It'll show up in your inbox tomorrow around this time. You can just click on the link, and you'll be able to watch anything that you might have missed today. And I also want to let you know that there will be Q&A. It's not a one-sided conversation. We'd love to hear from you. If you have any questions throughout the webinar at any time, just go to the Q&A box, submit your question, and we'll get to it at the end of the webinar if we have time. And I also want to let you know that IMO does have some additional resources today. They can be found in the handouts window. And finally, my last note, if you want to learn more about our speakers today, just go to the speakers bio panel and you'll be able to learn all about them. I don't want to get too far into their bios today, just in respect to everybody's time, and we only have 60 minutes to cover a very complicated topic. So, but in light of that, I'd like to let each speaker introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about themselves. And today we can start with Irina Brooks-Smith.
Hi, Chris. So I'm Irina Brooks-Smith, and I'm the head of healthcare analytics in AstraZeneca. I lead a team that focuses on the use of real-world data in R&D. Thank you for the invitation today.
Yes, of course, of course. And Anand?
Hi there, everyone. My name is Anand Chakalingam. I am the head of real-world evidence for virology at Gilead Sciences. I've been at Gilead for about 12 years. Before that, I was on faculty at the University of California at Berkeley in the School of Public Health.
Excellent, excellent. And Amal, how about you?
Oh, definitely. Howdy, everyone. Dr. Amol Butla. I go by Amol. I am the chief informaticist for Intelligent Medical Objects, or IMO Health. Been with the company for coming up on 3 years, but have been a long time fan for the last 15. My background is I am a clinician. I'm also a computer scientist. I worked on my PhD in biomedical informatics with a focus on statistical machine learning and knowledge representation, all the cool stuff that builds fun AI models. And then been in the real-world evidence, real-world data space, running precision medicine, neurology, and oncology programs, and love to get down and dirty in data.
I love it. I love it. That's great. And Adiz, how about you, sir?
Hi, everyone. My name is Adiz Clay. I'm part of the IMO Health's commercial strategy team, and I lead up the life sciences commercial strategy here at IMO Health. And I used to be a biochemist, did my PhD there, and then ended up as a real-world data scientist. Now in the commercial strategy, trying to find applications of IMO Health's extensive expertise in real-world data, as well as NLP solutions to fit with the pharma needs.
That's great. That's great. Excellent. Well, as the audience can see, we have an excellent panel today. It should be a fascinating conversation. So, and as our title suggests, we're here today to discuss ways to empower clinical teams using real-world data. But before we get into the clinical component, I'd like to first dive into real-world data itself. You know, many organizations are considering or have already purchased large amounts of clinical data that does not guarantee results. So, Anand, in your experience, what are the most common barriers preventing real-world data investments from delivering tangible ROI, and how are you addressing them in your work?
Thanks. Great question, Chris. Some of the biggest issues we face, I think, are well, there are several. First of all, it's a credibility and education issue. I think that a lot of people are still understanding what real-world data and real-world evidence is. Sure. There are data sets. There are the real-world data is basically anything that's not a trial, and so that does end up confusing people. So there's a little bit of that. But I think ultimately that sort of leads to a question of, are the data credible? Are the data credible? There's a lot of experience leveraging data sets like claims and EMR data sets, but when you start digging more closely into the kinds of open fields and where some of the really rich data is, that gets really difficult for us in a data set like in EMR or notes sections of EMRs. So those are some of the biggest issues that we face. And then of course the other big issue is that we have great data sets in the US, but we don't have quite as many in outside the US. So those are a couple of top issues that I have.
That's great. That's great. And Amal, you work with a variety of organizations throughout the country. Is there anything else you're seeing from your perspective?
So when normally organizations engage with us, it's very similar to what Anand is mentioning, is the quality of data. And a lot of times where we find these fun activities, I will call them, is how to really disambiguate what is high quality and low quality. As researchers, we rush towards something that is very much organized in an EHR's information model or an outbound of some sort, a view of that. But is that really encapsulating the entire perspective of that clinical journey of that patient? So it takes a lot of effort to kind of say, yeah, that's good, that's not good. But then as we start digging more and more, and as studies refine further and further to specificity of a particular group of individuals, we always get asked the question, can you go up more further upstream? Can you go closer to how the clinician has approached this patient? Can you get there? And then all of a sudden the shift goes from that discrete data set to going to unstructured data. Let's look at the notes. And that comes with its own set of challenges itself. What type of notes? Where are you going to get these notes from? Especially when information systems that empower these EHRs have fragmented over the year. And you see modules everywhere feeding that central access point. And so it's a balance then between the clinical discrete quality and also validating from what you see from an unstructured source too.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, unstructured, it feels like unstructured is kind of where a lot of these insights are found, right?
And so there's a lot of vendors out there, and I challenge everybody to go test them out. And I've done this over my careers, is testing out different NLP vendors. But you really want to work with folks like IMO Health, like us, because we really encapsulate the clinical language. Everybody else has a bunch of tools to get to that, but nobody's really gone the other direction, whereas developing a language, a lingua mata that empowers NLP engines. And that's a different way that we've approached these problems too. So yeah, it is a fun challenge, and I implore folks to test it out, but there's a reason why people come to us at IMO Health.
Yeah. I mean, fun is in the eye of the beholder, right? So...
Well, I'm still a data nerd, so I still like to roll up my sleeves when I am able to wear sleeves. I'm based out of Phoenix, so that's maybe 1 to 2 days out of the year. But yes, I do like to get down and dirty in the data.
I love it. I love it.
I wonder, Chris, if I might just add, might add just like a couple more things. I mean, I think what Amol says makes sense, right? Like having multiple data sets also helps a lot. I think you're exploring, but when you ask about strategies we use to sort of overcome some of the barriers that we have, it's oftentimes looking across multiple data sets, a little bit of replication, a little bit of trying to understand what's going on in different places. That validity of what we get from data like this is really, really critical. Ultimately, when we're trying to develop and provide to different stakeholders insights from real world data, we need to convey to them that we know what our denominator is. We know that it's what we can generalize to. And so there are many different points of understanding, well, what is our patient population? And if we can use EMR data sets and NLP to sort of home in on and do that really accurately on a specific population and follow them forward in time, that's one of the huge benefits of real world data. So I think multiple data sets and making multiple investments, I think ends up being a really critical part of what we do.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, it feels to me that it just offers a different perspectives, right? And being able to find the commonalities within those perspectives. Is that right?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Fascinating. That's fascinating. So let's dig in a little bit here, and let's talk R&D. I think is a good place to go here. So kind of expanding on how organizations can better utilize these data investments. Irina, how do you see real-world data being best utilized in the R&D department?
Thanks, Chris. I think R&D is a very interesting use case, actually, when it comes to real-world data, because traditionally, real-world data has been seen as HEOR commercial data source. So the use in R&D is a lot more recent, and I think people have been a bit more skeptical to adopt real-world data in R&D. And I've seen this throughout my career in AstraZeneca. I've been here about 8 years. When I first joined, nobody in R&D wants to hear about real-world data, but now suddenly people do understand the value and the impact that it can have. And for me, real-world data in R&D can provide in three kind of main areas impact. The first one in early development, to try and understand your patient population. So what is the patient population that we are targeting? What is the unmet medical need? Is there an unmet medical need for that patient population? And how this data on actual clinical practice will inform our development strategy. And I think we need to think about the patient in clinical practice much earlier than at launch, or much earlier even at a phase 2 or a phase 3, but actually at the start of our development plan, and probably even in early research. The second part that I think is really critical is around study design and execution. So if we think about the way we have been designing clinical trials, is we ask a bunch of KOLs, what do they think the patient population is? And usually those are experts in the area, but they may not see as many patients on a day-to-day basis. Or we use literature on how we've run diabetes trials 10 years ago. However, the landscape has changed quite a lot. The patient population has changed and the treatment patterns have changed. So I do think real-world data helps us in understanding what is the inclusion-exclusion criteria should be. What are the outcomes that we should be measuring in clinical trials? How big that sample size should be? We are making investments of 100 million or above for phase 3, then we need to be very, very precise on who we're targeting. And the last part, I think, which is quite important, is the execution piece. So how do we support R&D and operations to identify sites for clinical trials? Are we bringing our clinical trials sites close to where the patients are? Do they see those patients that we're targeting? As well as how we can use it primarily to even get the data that's already collected by the providers, for example, in EHRs. How do we ensure that the data that's collected in EHRs can then be transferred into our clinical trial systems so that we reduce the burden of the sites, we reduce data errors, and people don't have to enter data multiple times. So I do think real-world data brings enormous impact in R&D, and I am really, really happy to see of how much the regulators are also now being open and pushing us to use real-world data.
Great, that's great. I was on a call with somebody else, and they mentioned that regulators are more apt to take risks, I guess, than a lot of companies. It was interesting to me. I never would have guessed that, but that's a fascinating piece that regulators are really kind of stepping up, aren't they?
Indeed, and there was I'm based in the UK, but there was MHRA paper a couple of years ago that basically states that real-world evidence collected in clinical trials is not of less quality. So right. I do think that regulators, if you have a good study design and you're using real-world data to generate evidence, RWE should be the same as the data you generated from your clinical trial. So I think we need to start thinking, we need to stop thinking about this dichotomy of clinical trials sit in this experimental space and real-world data sits in the other. Those are complementary.
Yeah, I love that. It's fascinating.
To jump in with Irina is You're absolutely correct. What you said is the landscape has changed.
Yep.
And you mentioned diabetes studies 10 years ago does not mean what's going on today in rare disease identification. Also, so the whole thing has changed. So I think regulators are getting more understanding in those challenges, that the competitive landscape has changed and the dynamics of these type of studies have changed. And then also the agility of bringing something to the market has changed too. And so there's a couple things going there. I also think is the way that clinicians are approaching the patients is starting to evolve too. I'm a health. We've been dealing with challenges from a provider workflow for pretty much 30 years, and then so we start from there. But clinicians, if you put me, who was trained in the early 2000s, versus somebody who's trained now, versus somebody who's trained in the 1970s, it is a completely different approach, because the knowledge has evolved too, and our approaches to the patient has evolved too. I remember in my clinical training, I got slapped really hard on the wrist by my attending because I approached a patient in a way that he wasn't trained. And so that also evolves too. And then of course the lingua mata of how we approach something has changed too. And then how do you codify that has changed too over time. So there's a lot of challenges, and it's great to see regulators starting to finally get on the bandwagon and demonstrating that we're demonstrating that, yes, there is a lot of value in real world evidence, real world data, but also making it tangible and utilizable too for an end user.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I mean, that's the gist of it, right? Just making that tangible, right? It's so important. So adding on to those thoughts, Adiz, I'd like to talk to you a little bit, just, how can site selection and patient recruitment processes be enhanced through integrated real-world data strategies? And I love this part. What early indicators suggest improved efficiency or trial success to you?
Yes, I'll actually add on to what Irina has alluded to earlier as well. I mean, as IMO Health, we've been enabling clinicians for the past 30 years for clinical documentation. So, everything that clinicians document in their problem list, almost for nearly entirety of US population, I think we're 90% plus of the US healthcare system has been IMO terminology. And we go as granular as, diabetes, insulin resistant with stage 3 CKD. I mean, that happens to be my expertise from my background, but that has been our injection into EMR and how clinicians document it. And I think what Irina was really alluding to is, how do we design the clinical trials? How do we actually get the enablement of the sites? And we have a couple of solutions that can do that with our integration within the EMR workflow as well. So I think understanding how clinicians document, how the phenotype representation of these particular patients through our terminology and through our enablement services for the sites, along with pharma, will help sites actually refine those patients much quicker. So it's all about reducing manual input that the clinicians and the clinical research coordinators have to put in. And another thing that Irina also mentioned is elimination of duplication of effort, and that EHR to EDC, that's becoming more and more important. And I know that it is a big pain point from a regulatory approval standpoint when you have to go back and clean data afterwards. So that's when I think a lot of the NLP and data normalization will come into play. Again, IMO does well with both of those components just because of our footprint and our learned expertise in the past 30 years of how clinicians documented, how labs actually get converted. It's about, at the end of the day, getting to clean data so you can actually do cool analytics at the end of the day. Again, as a real world data scientist, I think 90% of my time was about cleaning data because the biostatistics and the statistics at the end of the day is still statistics, right? But you need to have clean and complete data so that you can run the appropriate statistical analysis for your research and for your clinical trial endpoints at the end of the day. So that's where we sit as IMO Health, is that interface of getting the healthcare data and turning something into actionable for anyone that is doing any type of analytical work with healthcare data.
That's great. That's great. Now,
can I just add? So, sorry,
go ahead.
I think I know, Adiz, you mentioned the EHR2EDC, and AstraZeneca has actually been a leader in this space for many years. I think maybe even a few years ago, this was seen as even internal, a little bit of a pet project from our group of, it is a good idea, but, nobody actually believed that it was possible. I think with development, I guess, in data being a bit more available, as well as AI and the ability to go deeper into the EHR systems, is making things like EHR2EDC a reality. And we've had a partnership with Memorial Sloan Kettering. We've had a partnership with University College of London, which is nearby to where I live. But it is great to see kind of these pockets of innovation finally starting to scale. And I think that's where we need to be in the next few years. We shouldn't be having people re-entering patients' information. We shouldn't be having, we should be utilizing what's already collected, but also have the tools in place to ensure that the data is the right quality.
You're 100% spot on. The operational costs of case finding, right? Or even if you're in the oncology side, going from abstracting something from the EHR using clinical tumor registrars, CTRs, to go from there, from the EHR into something that is encapsulating that entire journey for a fulfillment of a registry need. And there's a lot of costs and manual work and is a gating factor. But also what you mentioned earlier was that also has an implication of the quality of the data too, because you are using a individual's inference of what is going on behind the scenes in the EHR to something that is reconciled into a registry of some sorts. I'm curious to know if this is now I'm going to load this question up, is from Irena and Anand. How do you face those challenges as looking at data quality from that perspective, of understanding that the semantics of an individual can introduce bias into the registry or wherever the data sources that you're utilizing? So how do you account for that?
Can I ask a question about your question? Well, I mean, when you say semantics, you mean in terms of like the way that people are entering the data?
Entering those
variability.
The variability from understanding that this is informatician. So when I say semantics, it's like the codified journey, the actual explicit lingua mata that you say, okay, this person is a type 2 diabetic patient with chronic end-stage renal disease, stage 3, versus somebody saying this is a type 2 diabetes mellitus. So that type of the semantic quality of the data.
Fascinating.
So, Irena, I don't know if you want to take a stab at that first. I'm happy to maybe just throw a couple of comments out there. But you go ahead if you're ready.
I can try.
Yeah.
I can try. I think for us, context is very, very important, and having people trained that understand the context of real world data and how that's collected and understand the healthcare system. So if you think you make the comment of type 2 diabetes, I mean, in my days when I used to analyze claims databases, there are a considerable amount of patients who have both type 1 and type 2 diabetes. Now, we know that that's not the case, but that is a data quality error. So people in my team, we would be developing algorithms to say, well, actually, if you have these criteria, then you are definitely a type 2. And if you have these other criteria, then you are a type 1. So just relying on the coding is not possible, because you need to understand that coding can introduce errors. That doesn't mean that the data shouldn't be used, but you need to add that context and in the data. Another one is, for example, around, I don't know, if you're looking at patient journey and then you look at EHR data, you're not going to be able to understand what's happening to that patient without the additional claim. So understanding those points in which the patient is interacting with the health system and what is the data is collected for by that health system, I think it's very important. How we deal with that, I guess knowledge and getting people to, training and getting people with epi background is important. But I think one other thing that we sometimes undervalue, I do think that even data that's not as great quality is still useful because it does give you information on trends. So what we sometimes do, we will run a protocol on EHR data, but then we use claims databases, etc., to validate some of the assumptions and to validate some of the hypotheses that we generate from data. So how do we use different type of data sources to provide us with a bit more confidence that we're doing the right thing? And also, I think a good study design is paramount. I do think people should study, everybody in healthcare should study epidemiology, but that's, a bit of a pet peeve of mine.
Yeah, that's another webinar.
Yeah. Irena, I could not agree more. I think that what you said at the very end is probably my biggest pet peeve too. I think, understanding the biggest problem with the credibility of real world data is that, I think if you approach it purely from a data perspective, you could easily say that if I scanned all these EMRs and I found that only this many people had evidence of diabetes, that's my prevalence of diabetes, without thinking about the reasons for which that data were collected. All of these are secondary data. They're all collected for different purposes. And so the secret sauce and the care that one takes in setting up your design, making sure you have that concept of observability, or as you said, the patient journey, so that if you are looking for outcomes, you know that you can actually look at that in something where it's available for everyone and is not dependent on the variability in terms of how the providers enter data into an EHR. That said, you can also find, you might also find that you can what we typically use EHRs for is to come up with as solid a diagnosis or as solid a case definition as we can. Sometimes recognizing that for some patients who probably do have the condition of interest, they may not have all of the data elements that we need just because they're not captured in the data. And so then the other thing that we're doing, and I think that you alluded to as well, is leveraging that sort of gold standard diagnosis that you can get out of an EHR where it's captured really well, and maybe with some of the additional NLP processing to extract and pull more elements out to give greater confidence that the patient actually has a condition of interest. And then going back to things like claims and trying to predict that, so where you have linked claims, yep, and those EHR data for those patients where you have a really solid diagnosis, coming up with a prediction model that allows us to then take those claims and maybe expand our population a little bit more, which has been a really interesting use case for us.
Agreed.
Yeah, I love that, guys. It's fascinating. And that's always one of the biggest, trust, credibility, just huge elements of this conversation. So real quick, Adiz, you're at IMO Health. You're focused on building solutions to quickly optimize data and make it more manageable for your clients, around the world, around the country. Can you share why that's important and perhaps offer us maybe a specific example or two of when structured terminology and normalized real world data significantly improved patient ID or reduced screen failure rates?
Yeah, I think we've all kind of touched base on this, and it has to do with data hygiene that is with part of the EHR, and then when it goes to translation into claims data as well, and then the linkage between EHR data and the claims at the end of the day. I mean, where we do sit is that problem list management and the problem list, which is not necessarily what ends up going into the claims of the patient, right? So I mean, one needs to also understand that ICD codes were quite literally built for insurance purposes. There will be a distinction of left breast cancer versus right breast cancer, but there will not be any distinction between stage 1 and stage 4 breast cancer. They're clinically very different things. That's why coming as upstream as possible, I think that's where it's going to make a difference. And again, if you have access to all of the linked EHR records in an ideal world, which US is far from it just because of how fragmented healthcare systems are, you're not going to ever really get to that particular point. Where we do sit is that problem list where the doctors would document these things. So where we excel, and that's where I think we have been very successful over the past 30 years, is understanding the clinical nuances, because we've learned from the US healthcare providers and English-speaking providers across the world, is how the clinicians actually document these things. Because we do know that a HER2 positive stage 2 breast cancer is going to clinically differentiate from any other type of breast cancer. So that's where we document it. That's where we can extract and pull all the information. And it definitely shines through in the cases of biomarker-driven oncology trials or any other biomarker-driven disease for that matter, where the clinical specificity matters, as well as rare diseases. So we have had a couple of customers that came to us to identify these particular patients using our terminology, where we can actually say, here's how we know that 90% of US-based health providers actually document a rare disease patient using these particular terminologies. And because we are so well integrated within the US healthcare system, we can give you the right tool set that you can go and plug that into your EHR, effectively reduce the haystack from millions of patients into something that's much more manageable for a clinical research coordinator. I mean, there have been additional studies where, again, independent studies that, because we are so well integrated from epidemiologists actually, that show that IMO health terminology almost one-to-one matches with manual chart review. So it is a good stand-in for manual chart review as a semi-structure. It's never going to replace the clinical person coming in and reading all of that. But that's, I think, a good approximation that we can provide to the market today.
Yeah. And Adiz, is that something that you know, when you have clients come to you, is that a fairly common request from you?
Yeah, I mean, we all know that, I mean, clinical trials, 50% of the sites do not perform at all, 85% underperform, right? So, you know, if you can reduce the friction, and that's the majority of the clinical development and clinical trial cost, it's that pre-screening and screen failure rates what matters for a lot of the drug development costs. So any ways that you can actually reduce that effort and shrink the time as well. I mean, no clinical trial starts with the intent of failing, but a lot of them get delayed, right? So, you know, how do you reduce that time? How do you make the sites more effective? Because we all know that the patients exist. If the patients didn't exist, there would be no drug development efforts that go along with it, right? So it's a function of trying to find those patients. It's a function of enabling the sites to perform their best and do what they do best, which is provide clinical care. Our job is to make sure that that process is as smooth as it can be. And then for pharma's job is to collect all of that data and turn that into something actionable and submit to regulatory review so that the drugs that are needed for the patient care actually get on the market as fast as possible. I mean, that's what actually drove me to leave academia into industry, is you want to make sure that you're bringing medications that help even one patient's life at the end of the day, right? Because they do work, and when they work great.
Yeah, I know it's sometimes forgotten, you know, in these conversations, is the patient at the end of all of this trial and all of this this journey. You know, at the end of the day, it's a patient trying to get better. So I think that's a good call out. So Anand, I'd love to focus on you for a moment. And, oh, go ahead. Somebody want to add?
No, I just wanted to add because I completely agree with Adiz's comment about the patient, but I do also think that the site matters. So ensuring that we reduce the burden of the site, I think it's paramount, because a lot of he said most of clinical trials are delayed. I think it's like 80, depending on what stats you look, it's like probably 80% of clinical trials are delayed. We spend hundreds of millions and we're so inefficient. And not because the drug doesn't work, but because we do super complex protocols that the site can't follow, and patients are not eligible to enroll, and they have screening failure, which are completely unrelated to their disease or completely unrelated to the drug that's being tested. So I do think that having the clinical depth in EHR, either in patient notes or pathology reports or whatever those sources of information are, and using that to maybe pre-screen patients is going to be one of the, I think it's going to be a game changer for us in how we run clinical trials. So completely agree with that comment.
Yeah. Anybody else want to add on to that?
With Irena too, and I also think from a physician's perspective, there's going to have to be a little bit of a culture change too, and supporting clinical trials activities as a part of the prioritization too, and what type of infrastructure can be developed to alert physicians that this is a possible enrollment, and what type of additional features or additional information that needs to be curated at that moment in time, what additional tests. But then also we have to balance out as clinicians is the other side is, will the payer pay for this too? Yes. And so there's a lot of little balances and little idiosyncrasies, but I think the way that medicine has evolved, traditional medicine, if everybody knows this, evolved from the 1940s. But what we're getting towards is more precise medicine, which actually only started evolving 25 years ago, after we started sequencing the human genome and understanding the depth of what that means, the implication of the genotype to the phenotype. And so, as I said, this has to be, what I mentioned earlier was clinicians are trained differently, but there's also going to have, because that training is evolving, there's going to have to be some cultural shifts too.
Yeah. Now, I'd be curious to hear, from the whole panel, really. I love that piece, that cultural change. Have you seen this in action? Adiz, you're talking to different clients around the world. Have you seen this cultural shift kind of in action, or what's kind of been the reaction to that?
Just this year alone, I think I've been to enough conferences about clinical trial recruitment and use of real world data, and how do we make the clinical trial process and clinical trial design fit with the real world examples, right? That's what it kind of comes down to. And I think coming back to what Amol was saying, the modern medicine was developed based on maybe one or two racial and ethnic representations, and maybe even a lot of gender bias. So when we take the normal inclusion criteria, that does tend to exclude a lot of what is the current landscape of US population and world population, right? So I think, learning from a broader understanding of real world data of what is the norm today is going to change. And also, sensitivity and specificity changes of tests as well. And what we know about medicine changes as well. So, yes, looking back at something that's 25 years old is going to be very different than what is currently happening today. And I know for a fact that a lot of the medications are developed for the personalized medicine at this point, right? So, everything is biomarker driven for a good reason, because you want to segment and reach the right patient population that will benefit the most from that particular disease. And it obviously changes from therapeutic area to therapeutic area, and vaccine development is significantly different than a targeted kinase inhibitor or a gene therapy, obviously. That being said, what it does still come down to is clean data and making sure that all of that real world data as a collective whole, not necessarily just claims or EHR data, but also, wearable data that the patients experience and the circadian entities that a patient might be experiencing, and getting all of that. So putting more of the patient and the patient experience rather than how it was documented 70 years ago is much more important. And I think we all are appreciating that, but that comes with the cost of cleaning the data so you can analyze the data. And it's not an easy task.
No, it is not. Anand, I'd love to hear your thoughts. I would like to first hear your thoughts about, like Amal mentioned, the cultural shift. I think that's a fascinating conversation, and it may be, once again, a conversation for another webinar. But I'd also like to hear kind of, what kind of practical challenges might clinical ops teams encounter when integrating real-world data into their own clinical trial processes. Everybody's got their own way of doing those things, and what can be done to kind of mitigate those challenges as well.
Well, a really quick comment on the cultural shift. I mean, in my time at Gilead, I've spent some time in clinical development as well. And I know that even in this time, in the last few years, we were still sending out site feasibility questionnaires to sites and, just being absolutely shocked by the fact that, anywhere between maybe 10 to 40% of the patients that we were told would be available at sites were actually available. So the site feasibility questionnaires, these are sites that are looking through the records and saying, yes, I've got this many, but it's often not the case. So I think someone was alluding to that earlier. In terms of data and challenges in operationalizing in clinical trials, I think for me, I think one of the biggest issues still ends up being, first of all, we're really still my focus, when I'm talking about this is really on the U.S. because it's where most of the data sets seem to be, but it's really representation of the target population and sort of making sure that that's actually what we're getting at. And I mentioned this obviously because Gilead we're focused on antivirals, and so these patient populations are they're oftentimes in pockets that may or may not have representation in data sets. So that's an issue to consider. But probably the bigger issue, once that is addressed, and there are different ways to address that, and there are data sets that cover lots of different populations, is then really operationalizing those IE criteria, the inclusion criteria for a trial. That's one of the ways that real world data has been very helpful, because it allows our clinical trials teams and our clinical development teams to really think about the impact of, what is the impact of that inclusion-exclusion criterion? Assuming that we can actually get it operationalized well, which is not straightforward. But once you do it, it is hugely, hugely helpful. It tells you that, this thing that somebody thought was a really nice thing to have, is it really nice because it actually drops your population by 40% or 50%. And that has major impacts in terms of the number of sites you have to open, the duration of follow-up, all of which extends time. I think ways that we've been thinking about sort of addressing that, and what I'd like to see more of, is validation of those IE criteria and the ways that we're operationalizing them, and how does that actually go back to the patient population when done in real life, like in real data, in real patients, and not just from not just from the EMR data or whatever we're using to address. That's probably the biggest challenge I think that's facing the teams right now. But on the other side of that is that huge opportunity, right? And we're seeing elements of that already.
Right. No, I noticed when you said validation, Anand, both Amal and Adiz were nodding, and I think Arena was nodding as well. Did you guys want to add on to that piece?
I'm in complete agreement with Anand. It brings up maybe a specific challenge which you mentioned, Anand, was not indexing towards Gilead's business model of virology and identification of patients, but you mentioned something really important is that it is small subsets of groups of individuals, and it can be for any reason, these individuals. And what pops into my mind is my love affair is working with rural communities. Now, rural communities are maybe 200 miles away from a main academic medical center. And so I go into very rural pockets of Arizona, and I like to go help out whatever ways possible I can, and support them. But that I want to understand is, how does organizations like AZ and Gilead approach that challenge? Because those individuals are so far removed, but they provide so much clinical value to a patient population. And so I'll mute myself now.
Do you want to go, Anand, or do you want me to have a go?
Oh, Irene, if you've got, I'd love to hear what you have to say.
So, I think that is a great question. I think, to Anand's point earlier, and maybe a little bit of like the journey that we've had in AstraZeneca. Initially, we were using real world data to optimize that inclusion-exclusion criteria that we were talking about. Is our study feasible? And if it's not feasible, how do we make it feasible? How do we make sure that funnel doesn't end up with very small patient population? So that is one thing. The second part is, how do you go from that scientific insight into an operational insight? And I think a challenge that we've had in the past is that how do you ensure that real-world data is embedded in the processes of clinical development? Because real-world data is one piece of the puzzle. Another piece of the puzzle is actually, does the site nearby has experience in running clinical trials? They may have a lot of patients that you need, but probably they cannot run your clinical trial, or probably you've used them before and they recruited 0 patients, so you don't want to go back there again. So, and then the third piece that we're also trying to understand is, who are those PIs maybe that have an interest in this area? So how do you bring all of these little pieces of the puzzle to help your clinical operations team to open the sites where the patients are, where you know that they can recruit and can run a study, but also where you know that you have a PI who is who would like to who's expert in this area. But also, how do you use this information at the start of your trial rather than at the rescue time, and how do you use it at scale? I think those are the things that we need to address. I feel we are not at the stage now where we have to showcase the value of real-world data. I think we all agree that real-world data is important and is a critical part of drug development, but how do you embed it in the processes, and do you embed it at the right time in the processes?
Those are really great points. Amol, I think that the one, I was thinking about what you were saying, and I think the other thing that real world data can enable is it enables possibly to access patient populations who are far from a major institution, and I think that some thought has to be given into why a patient who is in a rural community doesn't access a major institution. That may have an impact on the generalizability. It may be driven a bit by the conditions of interest. So, you'd imagine that something that's very acute and very severe must be seen at a larger institution. That may be some places, but maybe some more chronic conditions, maybe those would be places where so I don't know, you'd have to think a little bit about, as always, it depends. But I think the power of real world data is that it could allow you to follow those patients, to access those patients, to access first, and then to follow potentially those patients. And this concept of decentralized clinical trials has come up in a lot of spaces. We don't have them here at Gilead, but it's certainly been intriguing to consider that possibility. And I think real world data really helps enable that.
it brings up a real significant challenge too, is when you go to a decentralized model, right? We know that when we're conducting let's say a longitudinal study of patients, right? Well, the provider is inputting information into that EHR. The EHR will encapsulate more than likely IMO terminology at the front end, but then it's actually mapped out into major code sets, as Adiz mentioned, ICD-10-CM for billing purposes, or LOINC codes, or something SNOMED, and those provide big buckets. And so when you look at those big buckets of information, and then we try to go to a decentralized model, they're using some sort of standard, the HL standards for interoperability, to encompass that. But those standards utilize big code systems. So the clinical intent is also lost too in translation from rural sources to even academic medical centers, because they've gone to such a high level of ambiguity in comparison to what the original clinical intent was. So I see some challenges there. Also, what I was mentioning is with like a retro study, right? You want to do a breast cancer cohort, right? Well, even those code systems have changed over time too. And there's some idiosyncrasies about major code systems too. And so I wish everybody adopted IMO terminology, because we've encapsulated that. But it still creates a challenge when you go to a decentralized model that's using it and you're using different interoperable standards like HL7v2 versus FHIR and so forth like that. So I see some work that needs to be done there. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
I love it. I love it. Hey, I mean, if it was easy, Amal, we wouldn't be doing it, right? So we're we have about 8 minutes left here. So I'm just curious. I don't want to, for the audience, I want to kind of leave on an optimistic note here and talk a little bit about maybe where this is going, in the next 3 to 5 years. We've had an interesting conversation talking, from the 40s to 25 years ago and 25 years ago to now, and just how healthcare and medicine has changed. So technology is expanding exponentially, you could say. So I'd be curious to hear from the panel, how do you envision the evolving role of real-world data in transforming the design and the execution of clinical trials over the next 3 to 5 years? Amal, we could start with you, since you're you have you on the floor.
I think there's going to have to be, as I kind of mentioned earlier, is there's going to be a little bit of a shift. And I think how we aggregate data at the point of care and how that rolls out into various operations, such as clinical trials enrollment, or even some identification of patients. I think that's where we can start thinking about novel approaches. And that's what we've been doing at IMO Health for the last 5 years, is really try to figure out how to make that data from the point of care as tangible as possible for various operations. But what Irena also brought a very good perspective is, as I approach a patient, I know exactly, my cognitive model knows exactly what to order for that patient, but that may not be good enough for the enrollment in a clinical trial. So then we have to think about a technological approach to maybe notify. And I know I'm going to get flamed by the informatics community, is another alert, but alert fatigue team. But it may be something like that. And but I'm not saying the challenges are insurmountable. I think it's just going to take a concerted effort and really harp in that the reason we're doing these type of investments as various organizations ultimately is to help the patient at the end of the day.
Right.
A lot of folks in like the rare disease space, they shop doctors for years until they get a diagnosis. And so what can we do as researchers and clinical experts and informaticians to really start getting that enrollment or identification that they could be possibly enrolled to help them out?
Yeah, I love that. I love that. Anand, what do you think?
I think that there's, I think like Irena mentioned earlier, I think that we're on a good path. Like I think that real world evidence is well accepted, and the use cases and the acceptance by increasing acceptance by regulators is a very positive sign. I and I think that we sort of chip away at like some of the criticisms, some of the weak points of real world evidence and real world data by applying methods, by showing rigor, and by being able to convince, and thus increasingly convince stakeholders sort of across the board. But it's not easy. And I think that it takes people with lots of skills, across the board. It takes, as Amol mentioned, like, bioinformaticians, it takes epidemiologists, it takes clinicians, it takes policymakers, it takes regulators, it takes executives to make decisions. But we have to do it with care. I mean, like the reason that we are in this space, to help patients, but also there is a worry that if it's sort of the Wild West, and if we are just taking data and torturing it until it tells us what we want, that these data are going to be deemed incredible, not non-credible. Not incredible. But so that's the care I think that we as a community have to take, is to show that the data actually are reliable and can hold themselves up and can be held up in the same level as a clinical trial. And where it can't, we need to be really transparent about that too.
Right.
Because it's a risk-averse world, and we can't do harm. And so this is part of our responsibility as a community.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. Irena, what do you think?
I couldn't agree more. I think that is one of the key aspects, is how do we ensure that we increase the credibility of what we are producing. The second part, which I think and maybe this is not in the next 3 to 5 years, but my vision is that I want to live in a world where every patient is part of a clinical trial. And how do we work with the healthcare systems to make sure that our clinical trials and clinical research is conducted at the same time as clinical practice? So, as I said, I don't think this is the next 3 to 5 years, but how do we cross that barrier from running very isolated experiments in phase 2 or phase 3 to ensuring that patients who are eligible for those medicines, and those medicines are tested in practice. So for me, kind of that is where the future should be. I don't know when we will get there, and there is a lot of work to be done. I do think the other thing that we need to think about is the data fragmentation, even in countries like the US, and how we work as a community. It's not just the payers, the policymakers, pharma, providers, but how we all get together to set up those standards and to collaborate, because at the end of the day, this is benefiting us all and is benefiting the patient. So I do think it will need a consortium effort.
Yeah, I think that's great. That's great. Adiz, I hate to do it. You have 2 minutes, young man.
I'll be quick about it, but so I think in the next 3 to 5 years, the data fragmentation is not going to change, right? Like that has been built into the US ecosystem. That is not unfortunately going to change until we start having more deep policy influences. There might be concerted efforts to collect the data and aggregate the data, but separate discussion point. What I do think is we're increasing our clinical documentation with AI being present, with the AI scribes and ambient listening. So I think we're going to start collecting more real patient information, and that will hopefully increase the utility of real world data and maybe address some of those credibility issues that the patients might have. The organizations might have.
Yeah, I love it. Well, everybody, we're just about out of time. So thank you I want to thank all of our speakers today for jumping on. Fascinating conversation. I mean, we could do this probably an hour a day for the next month and, and still not get to the bottom of it. So it's fascinating conversation. I want to thank IMO Health for sponsoring this. And I also want to thank everybody for asking questions. I know we didn't get to any, but if you asked a question, we didn't get to it, we'll be sure to follow up if we can via email. I also want to remind everybody that in case you had to jump out for any reason today, you're at work and you had a call or something like that, you'll have a link in your inbox tomorrow and you'll be able to catch up on everything. So thank you very much, and we hope to see you next time.